Joel's generous participation in this exhibition was essential to its success, and we extend our very deep appreciation to him. With 1,800 of Joel's photographs in our collection, this is just the first of many we will present in the future. Please join me now to welcome Joel Meyerowitz.
No lectern for me. I like to be with you. And what are you all doing here? Isn't it time for a nap on Sunday afternoon after Thanksgiving? Well, I really appreciate your words and that NSU has accepted these 1,800 photographs, and Ariella for really putting together a show that opened my eyes to my own work. And that's one of the surprises, I think, to have a curator look at works that we, if you're photographers or artists, you might have forgotten about over all the years as you move forward. And for someone to bring things together in a way, it's so refreshing. I walked through the show today with my daughter Arielle, who's seen all these pictures throughout the making years of my life, and has been a good critic of mine many times and advised me profoundly. And yet the two of us walked through the show today and it was like, ooh, that one. And so it's exciting to be sort of, to reinvent yourself through the eyes of someone else. So I really appreciate what you've done, big time. So I'm going to show you some slides today. Many of them are not in the show and some are. But before I begin, I wanted to talk a little bit about this medium, photography. I've noticed a lot of photographers in the room. I've seen cameras all over here. Who in the room considers themselves photographers? Yeah, look at that. It's like a club. We're in a club together. So you know, photography is whatever you make of it. For me, photography is about the disappearing moment. That sometimes we have an instinct to see something, you know, not some gesture or some action off to the side, and we turn to it and we recognize in that moment something interesting. You know, it may be more than interesting, but at that moment, it's the most interesting thing in one's view. And having a camera is a kind of license to see that. So it's a way of responding to things that you intuit or have a subtle sense of value without necessarily understanding what it really is all about. But your instinct is the thing that drives you to recognize it. And I think that it's often overlooked, our instinct. I mean, this is our native gift that all of us have. It's how our species has survived over all the millennium. Because, you know, if somebody is coming at you from behind, you have a sixth sense and you respond to that. And I think that photography is like that too. Just walking around with a camera in my hand always gives me a sense of preparedness and being ready for the unexpected. There's a Zen saying, I think, that goes something like, you know, expect nothing, be ready for anything. And photography is like that. So I'll show you, we'll start here, press the button, and it comes up. So in 1962, this is a little bit of the genesis. I think every one of us has a genesis story of when we decided to become the person who had an interest about something, whether it was teaching or writing or drawing or photography or, you know, being a lawyer or whatever. There's a moment when something happens. And in 1962, I was 24 years old and I was working at a small advertising agency in New York. And my boss, a woman, Estelle Ellis, who was such an important figure to me, had me design a small booklet about pre-teenage girls. Because this, Estelle said, why shouldn't they be consumers too? They're 10 teen before they're 13. So let's sell them whatever pre-teenagers buy. So this booklet was about that. And my boss, my art director, hired a photographer named Robert Frank. Any of you know who Robert Frank is? I didn't know who he was. I had no interest in photography. I had never had a camera. I was an artist and studying art history and doing graphic design. But I went down to the shoot to make sure that Robert fulfilled all the pictures that we needed. And within a few minutes of watching him work, standing behind him, he paid me no attention whatsoever. And I just watched him, and every time something happened in front of the camera, one of the girls or both of them at the same time made a little gesture or put on lipstick or had milk and cookies. Whatever it was, whenever the moment was reaching a peak, I would hear the click of his Leica. And it so astonished me. It was as if I was seeing time frozen by hearing that sound. And so when it was all over, I left to go back to the office, and as soon as I went out to the street, everything on the street seemed of significance to me. The way someone was schlepping her shopping bags along, the way somebody hailed a taxi, a mother holding a baby in her arms, all of it seemed to me to have a click to it at a certain moment. And so I walked all the way back to my office, 40 blocks in New York, to get to my office, just so I could stay in the street where all this action was happening. And when I got to my office, my boss said, "How was the shoot?" I said, "It was terrific. It was just amazing. I'm quitting on Friday." And he said, "Oh no, was it a disaster?" I said, No, Harry. It was so beautiful. It revealed to me that photography is what I really want to do. And I'm going to go out on Friday on my last day here, and I'm going to go start making photographs. And he asked one of those very sensitive questions. "You have a camera?" I said, "No, I don't." He said, "Schmuck, how are you going to make pictures if you don't have a camera?" And he opened his drawer and he handed me a Pentax camera of his own. And he said, "Here, use this until you can afford a camera." And that was the beginning of my life. And I have been out of work ever since. So I wandered around the streets of Manhattan, and you know, I didn't know what it was that I was going to photograph. But as I began to make work, I noticed that, come on. I noticed that I was mostly interested in women. But not, necessarily attractive young women, but just women, because they were a mystery to me. At 24 years old, and this is a mystery to me too, at 24 years old, I had this desire to know the world around me. And so, is this amazing? In 1962, this woman was on the street talking about electronic things that are going to have a camera could go through the hollow of a hollow needle. Big Brother is going to be one. She was like a savant, it seemed to me. And we had no computers back then. So it looks like it takes 3 clicks to make it. Did I miss one? And so, as Bonnie said, when I borrowed this camera and I went to a camera store, I said, I need film. And the guy says, "What do you want? Color or black and white?" I said, "Well, color." And it was like I had no understanding of black and white. Why use black and white when the world was in color? And so it just nurtured me in some way. Knowing that there was color film in the camera, I began to see color in life. And also began to see things that are ambiguous. One of the great characteristics of photography is that it describes whatever is in front of the camera. That's what it does. It's a medium that describes things. But even though it describes things clearly and sharply, it doesn't always make sense. There are things that have certain ambiguities in them that add a kind of content to a photograph. What's going on here? Is there do you feel some tension in the picture or something? You know? And yet they have nothing to do with each other. One of the assets of having a camera is that the world exists in 360 degrees on every axis all around us. But a camera is about 70 degrees, which is sort of our normal eyesight. And so if you just cut off everything else in the world and you put in a couple of things that don't necessarily relate to each other, you might have like a spark, something that carries a meaning or a curiosity or a story, but it's not necessarily really there. It's what you make of it. Why does that guy have his hat on his chest? Typical of that generation, when the American flag passes by in a parade, there were men who would take their hat off and put it over their heart to show their allegiance to the flag. So this guy did that just then because behind me is a parade. And so he did that. And this other guy with the dog is standing there smiling. And there's obviously some kind of classic racial inequity in one's mind, but not in this picture. And so it sort of makes a kind of a momentary comic characteristic, I guess. You know, in the beginning, no, it'll work or it won't work. I'll wave it around. When you're beginning, all the different disciplines of photography, the landscape, the portrait, the interior, how close do you get to somebody? These are all unknowns. And as a young photographer, I had to try to figure out how to get closer and how not to disturb the scene that's there. Because as soon as you present yourself too strongly, the scene changes. You interject your own persona. And so I wanted to be able to look all over the frame, the world, every situation, and find my own identity. Because I think being an artist of any quality, you have to find your identity. What is it that truly interests you, that you identify with in a certain way, that makes you feel like I'm consistent about the things that I care about and see? And that way you can build your own visual mark, in a way. Within that first and second year, I began to move from things that were more frontal and static to trying to see deeper into the space around me. I think in the very beginning, a lot of photographers are like shooting an arrow into the bullseye. You shoot at the thing in the center. And bit by bit, it's possible to enlarge the scope of your interests so that you can make a more dynamic frame that has interesting parts in it, but kind of new to yourself, which I think is how you grow and mature as an artist. 3. Did it jump more than one? No? I turned away for a moment. At the end of 1962, I realized that showing color slides to people, to my friends, meant that they were sitting like you are, a little audience, but closer to the screen, but no one ever got up to look at the parts of the photograph. And I had a friend who had made black and white photographs for years, and he showed me stacks and stacks of prints. And when I held them in my lap and I flipped through them, I had a whole different sense of what photographs could be or could do. You could read a series of photographs by flipping through them, going back and forth, and make the connections between them. Whereas in slides, it was always at a distance. And so I added black and white to my vocabulary in 1963, and it really allowed me to see things. You know, growing up in the Bronx, street life was always you know, full of the unexpected. And sometimes it was clear or comic, and sometimes it would be almost erased. And this is the first photograph that was ever shown in a museum. And it was in my beginning of my second year as a photographer. I made this picture of this guy in the Catskill Mountains because I liked the fact that you couldn't see his head and that everything else on the frame was sort of jazzy with, you know, light and shadows and scratching out. It felt very contemporary to me. And I showed it to John Charkovsky at the Museum of Modern Art, and he immediately said, I want this picture, I'm going to put it in a show, which was, for me, at that moment, such an honor to be thought of seriously. Am I being given a new clicker? Yes. Replacement. It's going to work now? Oh, so much easier. You know, thank you very much. It kind of, you know, throws one off one stride. You get lucky sometimes, what can I say? I mean, here too is like another case of ambiguity. What's going on? Is that hand, you know, grandpa or some stranger, you know, offering a little sweet to lure a kid someplace? This kind of ambiguity is part of what's so exciting about any moment in life. Sometimes there are unexpected beauties, you know, that just speak to you. When you know, I was sleeping on the floor of a friend's house here on a bedroll, and I woke up in the morning. This is Aspen, Colorado, in the early '60s, and the way the curtains were blowing and everything, and I just stood there and thought, how beautiful this is. And yet there was nothing of singular beauty there. It was old sort of barns and houses, but the curtain did it. If you don't carry a camera with you all the time, things like this will just go by unrecorded. You know? And I've been invited to a friend's house who was a puppeteer, and he wanted to show me his slides. And the first slide that came up while his wife was adjusting the screen was of the prop of an airplane out the window, which is sort of ridiculous, but in this situation, it felt totally surreal to me. Why should he walk if he could be carried? It's only 5,000 feet straight down. So, at the beginning, when I started working in color, as I said, I met, you know, some resistance. The establishment was all in black and white. Everything, you know, all photography seemed to be black and white. And I found myself at 24, 25, trying to prove that color had validity. And so I started carrying 2 cameras when I could afford the second one. And if the moment was lingering long enough that I could make 2 close together pictures, I would do it so that I could prove to myself or create an argument for myself to pose to the establishment that color has value, that if photography is describing things and black and white doesn't show you that those dots are red, then it's not describing what's there. And sometimes you can't tell the quality of the day or the season or the hour or the atmosphere. And I just felt that I needed to do a series of pictures that would show you something of the possibilities between black and white and color. I'm not saying that black and white isn't an extraordinary medium. It's just a reduction of the normal world. I mean, in some cases, the black and white is a better image. Maybe it's better framed, or the action is better. But I was not looking only at that. I was trying to see, this is Florida, not far from here. But, you know, if you look at the bottom of that blimp, the color is aqua. It's reflecting, the surface of the sea is reflected on the bottom of that. To me, that's something of significance. It's like a tone. If you didn't hear the timpanist in an orchestra, you wouldn't have that bing sound. And that's what that does for me. Of course, the ring toss in the shadow also was of some interest. I mean, making a joke, you might as well have it work on a few levels. I mean, sometimes there are surprises. To walk into a room in the Jeu de Paume in Paris and see, it's almost as if the painting had come to life in the window. But the atmosphere in the room are these sort of warm golden walls. And it just, to see it in black and white was not to have that experience. I've made hundreds of these pairings over a few years of work so that I could feel that I had an argument that was sustainable. Which one do you prefer? Color or black and white? Okay. So in 1966, I made a little money on an advertising job because photography, you couldn't sell photographs. There was only one gallery in New York City, and it was in a below street level old Chinese laundry on 10th Street in the East Village. And I saw Ansel Adams have an exhibit in this underground Chinese laundry, and the pictures were 25 bucks a piece, and nobody was buying them. So you had no hope as an artist to make a living. So all the photographers I knew, Gary and Winogrand and Diane Arbus and Lee Friedlander and Saul Leiter, all these people, they made a living in advertising or fashion or something like that. So I made some money on a job, and I decided to run away for a year with my wife at the time, Vivian, and go and travel across Europe. And this is one of the first pictures I made in England, in London, as I was driving around. And I just thought it was so absurd. And while I was driving the car. And I continued to photograph from inside the car because I was going to be driving for a year. I drove over 20,000 miles in Europe. And I always carried the camera in the car and photographed out the window. Because in a way, the window, when you're inside the car, the window is your camera. You're inside the camera, and you're driving it. And so if I carried the Leica on my lap, I could just pick it up and make the photograph instantaneously. And there were a lot of surprises at these moments. You know, 60 miles an hour, you're going along, and something happens. You see a dragon over a castle. It's like, oh, look at that. And then it's gone. You know. And even, well, everything. It's fun to take a risk and do something that you've never done before. When I came back after that year, I showed John Charkovsky at MoMA, 100 of these photographs. I probably had 3,000 pictures from the car. I showed him 100 of those pictures, and he gave me my first one-man show at MoMA because he said these were a kind of, unusual and disciplined body of work, and he thought that he should show them. So these are all part of that European experience. These are all in the show in the Picasso Museum in Malaga now. What was really interesting was that I was away from my New York buddies, which were Gary Winogrand and Todd Papageorge. And the three of us used to be out on the streets every day. And suddenly I was in Europe and I was out on the streets by myself. And I think it was that year that allowed me to develop my own sense of myself. And you know, I didn't see a picture in the entire year. I shot 750 rolls of film, and I brought them all back to America and processed them then. So I was working blind for the whole year, but I was seeing. Isn't it lucky every once in a while you see something that's just, wow, how did they happen to be on the same street at the same time? And the two, the monkey and the kid are sort of communicating in some way. So while I was living in Spain, I was out every day. Vivian was working in a ceramica, making huge pots, and then she was studying flamenco guitar with a gypsy family that we became friendly with. In fact, when we were in Malaga, Ariel was with me, the whole gypsy family, the next generation, was still together. And we had an incredible time. They all came to the museum, and we had a whole room that showed the life of the flamenco artists that they were. And it was just astonishing. But while I was there, I began to change. I was trying to move away from making a center-weighted picture to something that was really spread all over the frame, so that you'd have to read different things and sort of put it together yourself. And it was this photograph that was like one of those doors opening to a new kind of perception. I have to admit, I love this picture. I forgot myself, of course. You're absolutely right. I'm not blocking anybody over here. But I mean, this picture has such lyrical movement in it. So, to witness that on any given day, to have something of this kind of insignificance, but nonetheless beauty or poise, or something that just moves you, it's a reward on every day. I mean, I come back from just walking the streets sort of happy that I've been out in the world and seeing tender, moving things. If there was a point to this picture that the picture is hinged on, what would you say it was? Speak up.
The washing hands.
The washing the hands. Yes, it is that. That's sort of obvious. But for me, at that moment, the way this little boy locked his knees so that when he was pouring water from this cup on this half man's hands, look how nicely he's dressed in a suit and tie. That kid didn't want to splash. I mean, he didn't tell me that, but I could intuit that his gesture was such a sense of responsibility not to get water on the man, that he just poured these little drops. And that was the tenderness for me that made the picture. I mean, we see it now as the overall thing, but it's the humanity that often emerges from an observation of a scene as it's unfolding. It's that humanity that touches me as if it's a poem, a living poem in a moment. And it's that kind of vulnerability, I think, that gives artists their starting point, the go-to. So after living in Europe for a year, I came back to America, and we were already in Vietnam. And after having lived in the old world for a year, You know, everything around you is like from the Renaissance or earlier. And then to come back to America and to see what was going on. And this is a photograph I made on a Guggenheim grant I had. And it's the title photograph of a book that's yet to be published called Still Going. Because you know when you have a car that's failing you, but it's still running, and your friend says, how's that old jalopy of yours? And you say, it's still going. America seemed to me to be in this decline for some reason. And the way we processed the war, the protests that were going on. And so the photographs I made during this Guggenheim grant were about this quality of America, because I love America. I thought it was, you know, the greatest country in the world. But coming back and seeing the kind of problems and the quality of life and the inequities after a year in Europe gave me a new sense of purpose. I saw the absurdities and the kind of behaviors in America that just, it was a whole different world for me than Europe. A comical one too, it wasn't all bad. At a certain point though, you know, I think when any artist gets to a place where they're doing work that they feel really comfortable with, it's time to give it up. And I found that I was making, this is Fort Lauderdale, I was making photographs that had a kind of, you know, a kicker. There was something that made the picture be the photograph. And I tried to see if I could let go of this central incident, you know, like this, to let go of that kind of picture and start to make pictures that were more overall, that covered the entire frame. And I began to think of them as field photographs where everything in the frame would be of interest in some way without just being a singular moment. And it was really risky. And even my closest friends were saying to me, oh, you know, you lost your way, you know, these pictures don't have that little bite, that little joke. And I thought, yeah, that's right, they don't. I don't need to do that anymore. I think I have to push through to make something that could be read differently. You know, the dynamic of being all over the frame makes you work because there isn't a single subject that you say, aha, like the man carrying the poodle picture. And these pictures, in some way, I mean, particularly this one, pushed me beyond my comfort zone. And in 1976, which was when that last picture was made, I decided that I wanted to make photographs that had content and quality that was all over the frame. And I went and I bought a wooden camera, an 8 by 10 inch wooden camera on a tripod, which is totally opposite to the kind of work that one does that's so jazzy and moving on the streets. And I went to Provincetown. My best friend said, you ought to go up to the Cape. It will give your kids a nice place to spend the summer, and you might be able to work there in a way that would be a change of pace for you. And it was. And I tried to bring some of my street sensibility to these kinds of big spaces. And really, Cornhill Beach, for those of you who know, it really was so special to me, and light and time became different. I found myself working later in the day because with a long exposure for a large format camera, you could get the oncoming dusk, the darkness of it, would be part of the content. I made this photograph. It was just it was a moment. And when I, when I got home at the end of the summer, I hung it on the wall of my office. And it was up for a year. I always hang pictures up there, and I would keep on taking them down, but that one stayed. And another one that's in the exhibition upstairs of a young girl. And I realized at the end of the year that suddenly the portrait, the formal portrait, was something I had never done before, and I wanted to do it. And so using that 8x10 camera, I just spent a couple of summers, and I made probably 1,200 portraits of total strangers, stopping them on the street and learning how to go over to talk to them and just say, I need to make your photograph. And I would make only one picture of each of these people. You know, if you live along the sea, you begin to really understand the phenomena of water and sky and light. And I found myself making pictures about the division between air and water. I mean, these are part of the four elements that we all live with, right? Air, water, fire, earth. These are our basics. And so I was trying to make work that leaned into that way of looking at the world. Meanwhile, back in New York, I had a studio on 19th Street, and it faced south. And for years, I was photographing the landscape of Lower Manhattan from my windows. And in 2001, Ariel, my daughter, had a gallery in Soho, and we were going to make a show called Looking South, about pictures from this perspective. And then, just a few weeks before the show was to open, 9/11 happened. And I felt, as a New Yorker, a native New Yorker, I wanted to do something to record the history, because Mayor Giuliani had said no photography allowed. And I thought, how could you do that? This is a historic moment. How could you ban photographs? It's the one thing that's going to show us the record of the efforts on the parts of all these people who had gone in there to risk their health and their well-being to recover all the remains that they possibly could. So I spent 9 months down there going, 12 hours a day, day after day after day, until the site was absolutely empty. And I'll go back for a second. I had been given, with my wife Maggie, a commission by a publisher to do a book on Tuscany, because we had made a workshop in Tuscany. And I took the advance for Tuscany, and I spent it in Ground Zero. And the publisher called me one day and said, how's the work going? And I said, it's not going. I'm inside Ground Zero, and I spent your advance there. And he said, got to go do that work. So in January of 2002, there was just a lull in the site, and so I ran away to Tuscany and did some work there, which you're not going to see. But you are going to see that these phenomena of earth and air and water and fire became a sub-theme while I was there in Tuscany. And one just progresses. This was made during that, and this was made right here in Fort Lauderdale at that Olympic swimming pool by the beach. It's where the Hall of Fame is. So I went there and I spent a day filming and photographing there. I had to go into an underground room that was water up to here. It stank horribly. It was like a drain or something. And I stood in that room, and there was a glass window underneath the pool. And I photographed from in that room. So in recent years, I've been living in Tuscany for 10 years. My wife Maggie and I decided to just, change our lifestyle. And while I was there, I started to make still lives. just because I had never done them before. And one of the first still lifes I did was in Cézanne's studio in Aix-en-Provence. Because when I went in the studio, I saw that he had painted the walls in 1890-something. He had painted them gray. And today, artist studios are generally white walls. And I wondered, why did Cézanne paint them gray? And I thought if I photographed his objects against his gray wall, I might learn something about it. So I asked the curator who was running it, I said, would you mind if I just took down all of his objects and photographed them on the table here? And she said, yeah, sure, go ahead. It's like, what? It's crazy. And in order to learn more, living in Italy, there's a great Italian painter called Giorgio Morandi, dead since the 60s, but he painted still lifes that were extraordinary. So I went to his place to see what his still lifes were, his objects were, and they were all found objects, junk, that he put on the table for their shapes. And that taught me something too. And then I started to make some of my own, I started to collect objects, and I've never collected anything in my life because I have 50,000 prints. And this already takes up a lot of room, so I didn't need objects. But when I started to do still lifes, I asked, what would I collect? And I'm so surprised at the things that appealed to me and what I did with them. And I think I must have used the street as my sense of how you position things on a table rather than making fruit and stuff like that. So, in 2020, on New Year's Day, I woke up and I thought, what am I going to do this year? Because I like to have a project for the year. And I thought, everybody's making selfies, but I've never made self-portraits. So what would a self-portrait be like? And so for a year, every single day, I made self-portraits using the timer on my camera. And I didn't want it to look like, you know, as everybody puts on a face and tries to look pretty and everything. I just wanted to be me. And I treated the camera as if it was a photographer in the room who saw something interesting. Because with these cameras today, you can fire them with your phone. So all I had to do was have my phone nearby and click it, and the camera would take pictures at any moment. And I made about 3,500 pictures doing things as if I was looking at somebody else. I've never shown these publicly, so it's the first time you're seeing. See how it worked? I had set that camera up so that it would just fire itself. My wife had broken her leg and she was in the hospital for 10 days, and I was sort of on my own. And I was really feeling bereft of her presence and worried about her and everything. And I was sitting at a table, just sort of daydreaming, and I thought, oh. And okay. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.